Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about another shadow work topic, and we are going to dive into the world of projection. So I'm going to talk about how it feels to be on the receiving end of projection, how to recognize when you're the one who's projecting, and how the inner work with these topics have actually led me to understanding these non-duality concepts deeper, where it's really hard, I think, for the mind to grasp non-duality, the idea that we're all just one force. But when I do the inner work of self-love, of compassion, of forgiveness, and it is involving interpersonal conflict, it is really helping me to solidify the knowing, the true knowing of what that means, of what non-duality means. And so I am going to do my best to put that into words to see if that resonates with you. My name is Paloma, and I share some of my breakthroughs or places that I was stuck in during my mental health journey. It was a very initially psychological and therapeutic journey that turned into a spiritual awakening. So I will approach these topics from both angles to get a holistic view of how we can actually live an integrated life and apply these things into practice as opposed to theory. I remember seeing this video. It was it was a funny little skit. There was one lady who was like very clearly and objectively really rude and self-centered, and the friend talked to her about it, and she was like, whoa, you're projecting on me. Ideally, what this shows you is that the person who you're talking to doesn't yet have sufficient consciousness or compassion to meet you in a space of connection, and they're meeting you in a space of defensiveness. It's tricky because sometimes you want to have these clearing and clarity discussions with someone that you love. Best thing to do is then to just go and talk about your experience. Like, this happened and it made me feel this way, instead of accusing, because within the course of that conversation, you may come to realize that there was a projection based off of hearing the other person out and having the humility to recognize when that's the case. Now, the other scenario is when you go to talk to someone and you say, hey, this is what this made me feel. And then they explain themselves and you kind of say, and you go, oh, I distorted that one. And that has happened to me. So this is times when I projected upon someone. And actually, my initial response was to get angry at their response. And I actually talked about the situation. In case you have not seen the previous video, to bring you up to speed, it was about how I had two instances of being in these spiritual classes and workshops with male teachers. And I felt like when it was my turn to share, I was met with dismissal. I talked about how I used the concept of what I would describe as Christ consciousness, or my understanding of Christ consciousness, which is looking at a situation of interpersonal conflict beyond the field of right and wrong, stepping outside of that kind of thinking into a space where all that exists is just self-love and then naturally love for everything else. In that video, I had alluded to, as I was reading my journal entry, I made a comment that said, now I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just saying this is how I felt, because this video is now explaining and expanding on that way. Having the opportunity to talk it through is one way that we can dissolve projections. If the other person meets you with compassion and understanding, and if they're pretty evolved, then that's what will happen. That's how you can work through projections. And so finding someone who is willing to do that, who is willing to not be offended by what you bring to them, is one way. Now, with this, the way that I realized that I was projecting was actually because I received a recording of the class. I thought that he was pointing out my rambling to the group and calling it insecurity. When I watched back the recording, it actually was, I was very, yes, I had to pull up the text and I was caught off guard, but I was very composed. And on the surface, I looked very grounded, and it didn't really take as long as it felt like it took. And then when I articulated my point, in my mind, I was rambling. So when he made a comment about rambling and insecurity, it naturally felt like that was directly at me. However, when I watched back the recording, that's not what it looked like at all. I looked super confident and grounded and centered, even though my nervous system was like internally, I'm like, red alert, this is all eyes on you. You need to speak up. You need to say the right thing. You wouldn't have been able to tell. And so his comment couldn't have made sense as criticism, because that's not what it appeared like. I realized that the teacher did think that he was responding to what I said. It was a very loose interpretation of what I said, but there was a thread of connection. It wasn't totally random what he said to me. this is a really important lesson for me because it goes to show how our nervous system can distort our memories, how what we feel can become the truth, and how the objective truth can be something totally different. And then when I went back and I really listened, I could see that actually what was happening was that this teacher was sharing a vulnerability of him. And it was very loosely connected to what I said. So I didn't understand the connection. But here's the thing, I had an expectation. I had an expectation of how this conversation was going to flow. I expected that I was going to make a comment on this topic and the teacher was going to respond to that comment with wisdom. I had this, however subtle, expectation that wasn't met. And then I was hurt by that when there was no harm intended. And so, in an ideal world with a calm nervous system, I would be meeting those situations with curiosity. And I'd be able to say, oh, I'm curious what made you say that. But it was my own out of whack nervous system that puts me into, either fight, flight, freeze. What did you associate with what I just said to make that comment? And approached it for more connection. That's true connection. And that's the irony, is that I feel disconnected and dismissed, but I'm not extending connection. That is what's actually blocking the connection and my own expectations. And it reminds me of that quote from Saint Francis, where he says, "O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, for it is in giving that we receive, for it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life." Reflecting, I'm realizing that the complaints that I have, I'm not being that person. I'm not being that understanding person because I'm getting upset that I'm not being understood, while I could have instead looked at it as like, oh, my teacher is sharing something vulnerable as a bid for connection, and I totally missed that through my own ego. In my last video, before I started to read my journal, I made a comment like, keep in mind, I'm not saying that this is true, this is just how I feel. And then I went on to make a whole lot of terrible assumptions. And then when I realized and I saw the recording, and then also when I talked to the teacher one-on-one, I felt horrible about myself. Like, who am I that I have these terrible thoughts about people, that I assume the worst? Like, here's this being who dedicates his life towards ending suffering in people, who gives all free discussions and free discourses. Like, this is his own free time. And he just very passionately holds these meetings and people just unload onto him, all day long. And he does nothing but love. And how, like, what kind of monster am I that I would find something wrong even with that guy? But the thing is that I am not some monstrous anomaly. The truth is that most human dynamics are tainted in our own perceptions and judgments, expectations, and projections. And our job is to have the humility and self-awareness to question those, and then to take them into private and sort it out. And instead of accusing, instead of being aggressive, instead of hurting, that's why that last video that I made about Christ consciousness is the key. Because, see, even imaginary danger to our nervous system feels real. And so the point isn't that that is what happened, what really happened, what didn't happen. The point is that for me, it felt like a threat. And the point is that I found a way to get past the field of right and wrong, of hero and villain, of being a victim, and into this space where love is so strong, unity is so strong, oneness is all that is, that none of that is relevant anymore. And this is what meditation helps to accomplish. It helps you get in touch with a deeper dimension. Psychedelics help you get into touch with the interconnectedness of things. But still, they're concepts, right? Because what it appears is that you are you and I am me, and we have different bodies and different lives. And so how do you get past that? How can you start to really know that as truth? I've clearly outlined how our memory, our nervous system can rewrite stories for us. And then just the caution of taking that as truth, that whatever you feel must be true. Whatever you think must be true. We're not our feelings, we're not our thoughts. So it's about learning how to shift inner perception. And that can be most easily accomplished when you stop looking at it through an egoic lens. Remember too that these things that I'm talking about are nothing to be ashamed of. What it is evidence that I had such a wounded upbringing that has distorted my way of thinking, that has caused this nervous system reaction. Little me learned that being dismissed or misunderstood was just so painful that I've learned to anticipate it and to see it where it's not, as a protective mechanism. And so when I look at it that way, why would I shame myself now? That is a doorway into compassion, at least into self-compassion about this. If you do find that you have realized that you have projected onto someone, not to see yourself as like, oh, what is wrong with me? Why do I look at people this way? Why would I even think that? But to have grace for yourself and know that it is stemmed from very difficult circumstances during your formative years, perhaps even lifetimes ago, that have caused you to have a shield up. These people are showing you where you have armor that you can let go of, and it's a beautiful thing. It's something that you can celebrate and something that you can love instead of something that you shame. Now, if someone has projected onto you, I'll give you an example of when this happened to me. So it was a work, we were at dinner and it was a work situation. And I made a comment to a gentleman and he took it as an insult and said something back that was, I don't even really remember what he said back, but I just remember that it was like pretty hard. A little while later, the group had broken into separate conversations. And so a couple people were talking over here, a couple people were here. And so it was just me and that guy again. And so I said, when I made that comment earlier, I actually meant it as a compliment. And he looked kind of embarrassed about it. And then we proceeded to talk about other commonalities that we had. That would be my recommendation, is that if someone is coming to you and it is something that is a projection, it is like, of course you can explain where you were coming from. Like, the thing that you don't want to do is try not to be defensive about it or angry or make the person feel bad about it, because what that does is that it reinforces their belief of like, see, they are a bad person, they are an unsafe person, I was right. I want to avoid that by no defensiveness, just explaining, here's what I meant, or here's the way that I saw it, and here's where I was coming from. And you can still feel for them. Like, you can still say like, I'm sorry that this hurt you. I'm sorry that this felt that way. You can still care about that person's inner world and how they feel, even if you didn't mean to hurt them. Does that make sense? It doesn't mean that you're taking responsibility for it, but you can say, wow, I don't want you to feel that way. I would never want you to feel that way. And sometimes two people can be caught and be projecting onto each other, and that can continue for a long time. Usually a conversation is needed, and you're avoiding having the conversation, then you're going to avoid resolution, because sometimes there can be two people projecting to each other at the same time. And again, it's not about dismissing. If there's dismissal, then nobody is feeling hurt. It's about, how can this lead to more connection? Let me put aside for this very moment my need to feel that someone is connecting with me, and let me be the one who extends understanding and connection and compassion, and be that which I want to receive. We're not always going to have a recording that is going to reveal to us that that was a projection. So sometimes we're just not really going to know. And then it becomes irrelevant, because when you do start looking at, how can I bring love to the situation? How can I connect? How can I be the one to display the qualities that I want to see? Then it doesn't really even matter. And you don't, those little details, they just don't matter anymore. And it seems like kind of a crazy thing to even say or suggest, because we're so used to, and we live in a way of defending our perspective from an egoic lens, because we believe that we are that. And so it seems like an attack on the self. If you're holding really tightly to that view, then you see it as an attack on you. But if you realize that you're not that, you're not your perceptions, you're not your views, your opinions, or your feelings, it's not personal, and you're able to let these things go. That's why I do recommend reading The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, he talks about not taking things personally. So what's really great about this example is that it shows the different layers of shadow work. The first one was the situation where me, Paloma, felt slighted by someone, and I was able to do a process that helped me feel closure about the situation. That's one. Then the second layer is, oh, I realized that this was actually a projection, and now I'm judging myself for my projection. Still, I'm able to realize that compassion and love will help me overcome my own self-judgment about the fact that I projected on these people to begin with. That's another layer. Now I want to talk about the non-duality. And again, I touched on this in the last video about Ram Dass, what he meant by true compassion. I listen to Ram Dass lectures quite a bit. I listen to a lot of spiritual teachers' lectures, but he talks about how there is a compassion where, I'm going to read you the quote. He says, when you see someone who is hurting, your mind typically reacts, I must go help them. But from the vantage point of the soul, you recognize that the hurt is part of all of us. When you identify with your soul, everybody is a part of us. You don't act as though you're saving someone separate from yourself. It's like one hand pulling the other hand out of the fire. It's all part of the same body. That's true compassion. When one hand is in pain, the other instinctively reaches to help. It doesn't stop to ask, should I be kind right now? That's how love moves us through when we stop identifying with a separate self. When we remember that it's not your suffering or my suffering, it's the suffering. And awareness becomes compassion. He was saying, you see, one hand is in the fire, the other hand doesn't stop and think like, should I be kind right now? No, it's just going to get the hand out of the fire. And there's not even going to be a thank you or like, oh, thank you for saving me. It's like, it's one body. What else would you do? The way that I see this apply to my situation is that the tendency, what we've been taught to do and what your brain is going to want to do is to see a situation and automatically start picking it apart, and is automatically going to start saying like, well, was I right to say that? Were they right to say that? Who was wrong here? But when you're able to see everybody as one body, you can see how nonsensical that is. Because I'm not going to stop and say, should I be kind to myself before I get myself out of this fire? Same way, you don't have to stop and ask, like, should I be compassionate right now with this person? Because all of it is just you. So projection is like, you are doing this to me. You are hurting me. This is my wound. That's your flaw, the self and the other. And projection can only exist when we are living in separation. When you get into a state where that dissolves, the only natural response is compassion. Not even compassion how we think about it, of like, I see your pain and I can put myself in your shoes and I've hurt too, so I'm going to hurt with you. It's not that compassion. It's just one suffering, one compassion. There's not sides. And this is how you can see non-duality in action. So I do recommend that you go back and watch my last video, because you're going to see how I used a formula to get into Christ consciousness where right and wrong was irrelevant. What I'm describing is just my own process of how I was able to move from my own little view into a more universal lens. And from that place, there's nothing to apologize for, nothing to worry about. There's nothing to be offended about. It just doesn't fit. I can't fit in that space. What's really beautiful about this is that these teachers were mirrors for me to understand this in action, God's love in action. And that's alchemy. How can you do that? How can you do that with the things that you go through? How can you turn it into something beautiful? Share and hold and see and be that which you seek. Okay, I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. I am off to girls' night.